My name is Claudia Green, and this is She Did That, the podcast shining a spotlight on remarkable women who are breaking barriers and proving that greatness knows no gender. From female founders who have raised millions of pounds, the investors changing the landscape as we know it, to survivors of tragedy who have achieved the amazing and many more. We will share the stories of these incredible women who will inspire and empower you. In order to support us and these women, please subscribe on your viewing or listening channel of choice so we can continue our mission of sharing the stories that should and need to be heard. Today, we have Charlotte Guzzo, co-founder and COO of Sano Genetics. Their technology is helping the world transition into precision medicine, essentially facilitating clinical trials so we can help find cures for some of the awful diseases we experience around the world. So I'm very excited to welcome Charlotte. Lovely to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to speak to you. Definitely when I was writing the questions for this, I had to do a lot of learning myself because I can't say I'm the most scientific person in the world. So hopefully I'll do it all justice.
I'm
but
sure
feel free to jump in if I've misworded anything. So I guess just to start off with, tell me a bit about your background, childhood leading up to university, and how you kind of made the decision to study what you studied.
Probably quite unusual. Obviously, I'm in science right now, but I grew up in Paris in a family of artists, and so really nothing in my initial path was leading me to do science. I wanted to be a fiction writer growing up, so really quite different from what I'm doing today. But at some point in my life, I can't explain it really, and that was before the era of AI being so popular. I started developing a real interest for how the human brain works. I studied philosophy and literature in high school. So again, nothing here really predicted that I was going to go do a neuroscience and genetics degree. And we'll talk a bit about that later. But I think that what stemmed my initial interest in neuroscience, it was sort of bigger questions around free will and perception and so on. And ultimately, I just became really interested in understanding how the human brain works. So I applied to the University of Cambridge to do a degree in neuroscience. And I was admitted, and I had a really, really privileged and incredible experience studying there, which was pretty life-changing. This is the place where I met my co-founders, after all, and the reason why Sano exists today. But also, I'm saying I was privileged because in France, when you haven't, done sort of math, science, A-level, these sort of things, there is no real path for you to get back into this. Whereas here in the UK, I was able to apply to the University of Cambridge as a mature student, where they looked at the whole picture and in my interest and interviewed me. And so I was giving a place on this basis. And that was just a really great opportunity. I was humbled by the lecture I was having access to and by the incredible people I was meeting. It's pretty unique. It's a pretty unique place in the world where people are very open. You can sort of walk into a professor's office or go talk to someone who is doing some research, and they'll often be very open to talk to you about it. And that's something that doesn't really exist in France. So that was a very good experience for me. How did I get into genetics then? Because I'm talking a lot about neuroscience here. Ultimately, when I was studying neuroscience, I got really interested in particular by the brain development part of neuroscience. And so what happens during embryology and early childhood in terms of developing the brain. And a lot of that involves genetics because the developmental pathways for building a brain are actually regulated by genes. So this interest in neuroscience then led me to study more and more genetics, initially in the context of understanding brain development. But then later on, I decided to apply for a PhD, again at the University of Cambridge, but within the Sanger Institute, which is also a really unique place in the world because it's one of the world center for genetics, really. And it was quite inspiring to be surrounded by some people who are doing some really groundbreaking research there. And I found my match with my PhD supervisor looking at the embryonic origins of childhood cancer. So my PhD was focused mostly on trying to understand how genetic changes during embryology and during the development, during pregnancy, can lead to childhood cancer later in life.
Wow.
So that was...
Can you pick that up? Is there any genetic testing that can pick that up?
No. So it's not as simple as that. It was actually not sort of genome sequencing technologies that we were looking at. We were looking at single cell gene expression throughout embryology. The idea behind this is that in normal development, cells go on to differentiate to become, for example, a skin cell or a heart cell. And there is some, assumptions that in the case of some childhood cancers, there is an issue with the cell not developing fully as it should. So it stays in a state that is not fully differentiated, if you will. And instead of going on to become a heart cell or a kidney cells, ultimately it stays in a state of being undifferentiated, and later on during childhood can become, like the origin of a cancer. And so what this group was trying to look at was whether we could understand where in the development of this cell things had stopped, and whether as a result we could find potential drug treatment to force that cell into differentiating. So this wasn't my own research. This was the research of my fantastic PhD supervisor and his group. But it was just completely mind-blowing for me to walk into that and to see some of the data that was coming back from the lab. It was just fascinating, and it felt like I was witnessing, like the future. And that really got me interested in genetics, because suddenly I realized just how powerful and impactful it could be, not only in the case of childhood cancer, but also, of course, in the case of many rare diseases. It was Rare Disease Day just recently, and I think we all tend to think about rare disease as something so rare that it doesn't affect, that many people, and obviously that's the definition. But when you take all of them collectively, 1 in 7 people are affected by a rare disease. So being affected by a rare disease is very common, and unfortunately, these are areas where not a lot of treatment options exist for patients. So again, for me, this PhD experience was very impactful in setting the stage for how we would come to create Sano, and for suddenly developing a really strong interest in genetics.
You're getting me interested in genetics now. I'm probably not going to get into Cambridge though, but it's definitely interesting when you think about things could be almost like your future's a little bit defined as early as just your genetics forming. So I think that's really interesting, because you do wonder when it's not an infectious disease. You do think, how did I get that? Or why was it me? And so it definitely explains a lot if there's something within your genetic makeup that's sort of predetermined that you may be getting that disease.
Yeah, I think can be a key term here. There is a lot there. There are genetic susceptibilities, but there is also a huge element of gene-environment interaction. So again, genetics is really complex, but it's also why it's interesting. When we first sequenced the whole human genome, I think there was a lot of hope that, this was going to give us the answer to everything. And, as it always happens to be the case with life and the human body, it's the answer is it's more complex than this. You do have some disease where you can clearly map the disease to one single genetic change. And so the gene causes the disease, and that's as simple as that. If you have the mutation, then you're going to get the disease. But in most cases, it's many genes working together that can increase your risk of disease. And sometimes there are environmental components as well. So a genetic change can increase, for example, can change the way you respond to stress or to pollution, but then you need that stressor to actually go on and to develop the disease. So there is a lot of interesting research going on as well on the gene-environment interaction.
It's fascinating. And how did Sano Genetics come about? Because obviously your co-founders went to Cambridge with you, which I think is really nice that you were at university together.
We were, yeah.
Where did the idea, what you were just out drinking one night and thought, let's do this?
Kind of, actually.
The best ideas usually do.
Yeah, exactly. All 3 of us met in the same college at the University of Cambridge. It was a mature student college, St. Edmund's College. which actually was a fantastic experience because it usually brings people from all kind of different walks of life. All three of us ended up doing our PhD at the Sano Institute. So that was, again, a little bit of a coincidence there. And so we were passionate about genetics and in AI and different areas, but we were all at the same institute and I think observing the same thing. I'm going to talk about what personally drew me to creating Sano. What I was witnessing in the lab I was in, again, as I mentioned earlier, were really interesting findings. I was looking at the science that was being done and I was looking at the data and really thinking to myself, this is incredible. But one thing that I also quickly realized is that there were a lot of really smart scientists in the room that were going to go on to continue and elaborate on this research and probably come up with even more findings. What I wasn't seeing was someone in the room whose role was to actually make this a reality for patients. And we had children with Wilms tumor, with chordoma, with some of the cancers we were studying that were dying in hospital wards, a few miles from where this research was taking place. And I have no doubt that, over time, these things are going to be picked up on and eventually turned into something. But to me, it was really unsettling, the idea that these children were dying now. The emergency was now. It wasn't going to be, in 20 years, in 50 years, it was going to be too late for these kids. And I just couldn't see a clear path to, okay, whose responsibility is it to actually now double down on this and turn it into something. A lot of these institutes are now developing translational offices and trying to work a little bit more into sort of making sure that the findings, is turned into tangible outcomes for patients. But it's a hard problem to solve, and I'm sure we'll get into it because this is the reason why Sano exists. The world of clinical trial, the way the medical infrastructure is built, and the whole operations of actually turning research into a safe and effective drug are the bottleneck. They are the complex things in this problem. And that was really interesting to me, right? Because I just started to look at the problem, thinking we're generating incredible research at a very fast pace, but the operations of taking this research into the real world are just not keeping up. And I just felt at this point that this is where the impact was for me personally. This is where I wanted to change things. And I know my two co-founders felt similarly. Ultimately, we had lots of discussions about this. And the funny story maybe is Sano emerged from an entrepreneurship competition actually hosted by a group at the university that doesn't exist anymore, I believe. But at the time it was called Cambridge University Entrepreneurs. And they had put out a pitching competition, right? So it was like a 500 word, then 1,000 words, pitching ideas. And you went through the competition, elaborating on your idea more and more. And so the simple idea really behind Sano to start with, and obviously it's gotten a lot more complex, was we have scientists, researchers, pharma companies that are currently, sort of identifying potential treatment for disease. And we have patients dying of the same disease in other, corners of the world and sometimes in corridors of the same buildings. And so the two are not talking to each other. The idea behind Sano was, how do we match these patients with these emerging researchers in the best possible way so that the treatment has the highest odds of being successful and the patient has the highest odds of actually seeing benefits from the treatment. That was the initial idea. It's a complex environment, and so obviously there is a lot more to it nowadays.
I bet there's probably quite a few politics involved as well.
There is a lot going on. Yeah. There is a lot. It's a complex regulatory environment for good reasons, but sometimes the regulation is also not keeping up with the pace of progress. So there is just quite a bit to tackle there in the way things have been done historically. I think we're really lucky as well that we're coming at the intersection of amazing discoveries in the field of genetics, with gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9 technologies coming out, but also AI becoming a huge part of our day-to-day world and ultimately opening up the doors for things to be done a lot faster in many aspects of clinical trial design. So it's a hugely exciting time to be building this.
And so in terms of your end user for the technology you've built, is it multiple users? So you've got the people conducting the trial, and then you've got, can someone literally log in and use it? An individual?
Yeah, they can. So they can. The caveat is we focus on specific conditions. Again, our idea is to match patients into clinical trial that, are specifically designed for them based on their condition and often their genetic background. And on the other hand, our aim for the pharma companies, biotech and research institutions we work with is to increase the odds of a drug or treatment being successful by actually finding the patients that are most likely to respond well to it with minimal side effects. That's sort of like the beauty of precision medicine in a way. So yes, absolutely. The platform is, open to anyone who can sign up for it. There will be specific clinical trials or research studies available there for people who have specific conditions. It's probably less exciting or interesting. Interesting is probably a better word. It's probably less interesting for people, who are completely healthy or do not have a family history of specific conditions, because truly the aim of the platform is to actually matchmake people who may have, susceptibilities to some conditions with existing clinical trial or research progress or research projects to progress our understanding of the condition.
So do you have to see each individual's genetic makeup?
Yes and no. In almost 100% of our studies, there is a genetic component to it because it's a pretty strong basis for precision medicine. So yes, quite often, in most cases, when an individual qualifies for a research project or for a clinical trial, we send an at-home sequencing test. So it's a saliva spit tube that you can take at home, and we do genetic sequencing and share the data and clinical reports back with the participant. That then enables them to find out whether or not they're eligible to enroll in a specific research or clinical trial, and ultimately gives them access to those if it's suitable for them. But what I would say is that quite a lot of people who sign up to the platform initially obviously don't have genetic data. Part of the appeal signing in is actually accessing it if it's appropriate for, their history, and getting more insights onto understanding their risk of disease or understanding perhaps whether there is a genetic component to the condition that they do have. And we do have studies where you can sometimes enroll initially without the genetic sequencing, but ultimately it becomes a core part of most of our studies because we are trying to understand really whether there is a genetic component that might influence whether or not the treatment will be successful or not.
Okay, I understand. I'm probably not going to do that because that scares the hell out of me.
So what I would say is that it's a really important point you're raising, and I think it's a legitimate one. And we're taking a very conservative approach to how we're doing this. So we don't just sequence for anything and everything in everybody. Usually our clinical reports that we return to participants are targeted to the condition that, they have initially signed up for, either because they have already been diagnosed with it, so that shouldn't come as a surprise, or because there is a family history of the condition. When the condition is something that has implications for their life, family planning, their families, we always organize a consultation with a genetic counselor before the person takes the genetic test. So this is an opportunity to talk with someone who is qualified to actually understand exactly what you're signing up for, what you may or may not, receive in terms of results, what you may learn as a result of taking part in genetic sequencing and what that may mean and the impact that it might have for you. So again, the approach that we have is very patient-centric. The main reasons for creating Sano was we wanted to get treatment to patients who do not have access to treatment faster.
Yeah.
And to progress research in some condition areas that are, in our view, still lagging behind in terms of just how well we'd like to be able to treat them. But the data belongs to the patient. We are very careful with our consent model and with the level of care that we provide to people enrolling in research before, during, and after the sequencing process. We want to make sure that people who decide to do that are very informed about what they're signing up for and have all the support they need for this to be a positive experience rather than, something that's scary or, like makes them feel out of control, if you will.
Or if they commit a really bad crime and if the police can access their genetic details. Only because I was at a barbecue last year and we were talking about, I don't know how, we were talking about genetics and doing like these genealogy tests. And she's like, I'd never do it because I don't know, I might need to kill someone one day.
Yeah, I would say that's not really something we cover as default in our genetic counseling sessions. But
no.
Yeah, fair enough.
That one's a bit niche.
Yeah, it's a bit niche.
But there's things like the BRCA. Yeah, the BRCA gene, where you can take preventative measures. So actually knowledge is power. If you know that you have the BRCA gene, then, those preventative measures are unpleasant, but they could save your life.
Yeah, so that's exactly the sort of topics that genetic counselors grapple with all the time, right? There are conditions for which doing genetic sequencing can be really helpful because ultimately you can put in place targeted screening. You may have access to early, to some therapies earlier on before symptoms begin. And so, in these use cases, I would say genetic sequencing is kind of a no-brainer, maybe not. Everyone has their own reasons for wanting to do something or not, but, it makes sense. There are other conditions, of course, where we know we don't have treatment. And so getting genetically sequenced is a lot scarier. And that's when genetic counseling is really important because some people might want to know anyways. They might want to plan things better, for their family. They might want to be feeling a bit more in control about this. Others would rather not know at all. And that's absolutely fine. And of course, there is a third category of patients, and that's often the most common for us, where they've already been diagnosed with the condition. And so that's not a surprise for them here. But having the genetic data can give them access to experimental clinical trials that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, can give them a bit of an insight of whether or not that's a risk for their family or whether that's individual to them. And also, most importantly, for a lot of our participants, and, that's what amazes me the most about working with the patients we work with is because they selflessly want to progress research for future generations. They know that there might not be a cure available for them in their lifetime, but they find purpose in participating in this type of research to make sure that others don't have to go through this in the future.
That's definitely brave, to sacrifice your time when you're suffering for the sake of future people not having to suffer. So I admire that. You talk a lot about precision medicine. What is precision medicine?
It's a term that is encompassing more and more aspects to it. But ultimately, the purpose of precision medicine is to increase the efficacy of a treatment or optimize a treatment or even identify a treatment in some cases for only a subset of individuals or in some case for one individual by taking into account biomarkers effectively. So that, historically has been mostly genetic data. Nowadays, more assays are adding up on top of this. We look at gene expression, microbiome, and proteomics, other aspects that make an individual unique. And the hope behind this is that instead of prescribing treatment to people that are based maybe on their gender or age or symptoms, we can actually identify and prescribe treatments that are based on their unique biology.
So would you say when someone's having, for example, chemotherapy, obviously that has to be quite specifically formulated for the individual. Does that fall into the category of precision medicine?
It can do to some extent. So chemotherapy is, it's the same chemotherapy treatment, across the board. But there have been some really interesting precision medicine clinical trials that have made some progress in how we administer this treatment to patients. So I'm thinking, for example, about the Taylor-X study that ultimately looked at a gene panel of 21 gene and looked at the risk of recurring breast cancer in this subgroup of patients, and were able to identify in a way that was quite compelling which patients would need chemotherapy versus the ones who could just undergo hormone therapy instead of having both hormone and chemotherapy. And there are other studies like these. Ultimately, what this does is identify a subgroup of patients who can avoid the side effects of chemotherapy safely versus the ones who need to probably go through chemotherapy to minimize the risks of recurrence. And there is a lot happening in the oncology sphere as well, where precision medicine is playing a key role.
And how can specifically Sano speed up precision medicine? Is there like a link between that?
Yes, there is. One of the biggest issues in making precision medicine a reality is not so much the rate at which research is generated, because it's almost hard to keep up with the number of precision medicine papers that are coming up. And this is a very, very important part of the job. But the rate limiting factor at present is how quickly we can then turn these insights into clinical trial and figure out whether or not this actually works, and then bring a treatment to the wider public, right? This is difficult for many reasons. Clinical trials typically take 10 to 15 years to complete.
It's a long time.
It's a long time. There are obviously variations to this. It can be faster. It can be a lot longer. But you have several phases to a trial. And quite often the main reason why it takes so long and the reason why it fails is because, believe it or not, there is a difficulty in identifying the right patients to take part in the trial to start with, and also to keep them engaged throughout the whole period that the trial takes, which can be long. 80% of clinical trials fail. And often that is, that can be sometimes because the drug simply is ineffective or there are side effects, and that's the right reason for a drug to fail. But in many cases, it's also because of difficulty actually identifying the right patients. And I see that every day in my work. I think another interesting aspect of precision medicine in improving the outcome of clinical trial is you may sometimes see that a treatment is overall not working in the sense that it's statistically insignificant, but it seems to be working in a subset of patients, right? And it can be dismissed when actually it's something that could work for a subset of patients based on the genetic makeup that underlies the condition, and whether or not there is a genetic origin for it. So where does Sano fit in? Ultimately, we've built a platform that quickly identifies patients across the world. We working globally into multiple continents in countries, and we provide free at-home genetic sequencing to participants who are on paper eligible for a study or a trial. And we have a database of sequenced patients now where we know the genetic status. And so what that enables us to do is ultimately, as I was mentioning earlier, but in a slightly more complex form nowadays, to match the right patient with the right clinical trial a lot more quickly, and also to deliver a much more interesting experience for the patient. We develop a lot of content that is specific to their conditions, that is specific to their genetic background. We work collaboratively with key opinion leaders, clinical centers of excellence, to make sure that all the research opportunities and clinical trial that we can make available to them are resurfaced into one place that is, it would be, I was going to say, that is completely personalized to their condition and their genetic profile. And it would be funny if we weren't creating personalized space as a personalized medicine company. But what that results in is much higher engagement rates from the patients. Ultimately, we spend quite a bit of time updating them on the research. We spend quite a bit of time actually developing content and opportunities to progress research in their condition that is valuable to them. And the addition of genetic sequencing also brings an added insight that often they are welcoming. Right now, we have a really fascinating project called Light the Way that is focusing on the genetics of ALS. And currently, the waiting time to get sequenced when you are suspected of being at risk of ALS in the UK is 18 months. Now, as we know, the average lifespan for someone developing ALS symptoms, unfortunately, is short. And so, being able to obtain genetic sequencing faster and potentially to have the opportunity to participate in clinical trial in the earlier stages of the disease is important. And that's the kind of thing that we feel very passionate about at Sano. And that's how we are removing some of the barriers to transitioning into precision medicine. Ultimately, it's by matching the right patients with the right trials on a much faster timescale.
Yes, and I guess for individuals or families of individuals that are sadly suffering from a kind of disease or illness, they kind of have to sift through the trials themselves in all different places. They can be in all different countries as well. And a lot of families are willing to go on a plane and move there for a certain period of time if it could save that person's life. But there just seems to be a lot of moving parts. Also, I've heard a lot about you have to have the recommendation of your doctor, which is difficult because they might say, oh no, I actually don't. And that's just their opinion. This might not be good for you. So actually it sounds incredible to be able to directly match patients with clinical trials. Because there's also stages of disease, right? Like a lot of people get declined from medical trials because maybe they're too far along in their illness and it won't produce the right sort of data because...
Yeah, it's very complex. Like there is quite a lot to touch upon here. In terms of eligibility criteria, they're often here for a good reason, and those still exist in decentralized clinical trials and in precision medicine clinical trials. But the hope is that the more patients we have on the platform and the more studies and partners we work with, the more opportunities there will be for people at different stages of a disease and with different eligibility criteria to take part. You do have specific trials, for example, that focus earlier on the earlier in terms of the symptom progression, and others that focus on the later stages. And so again, like the idea with a platform like ours is that ultimately we can match the right patient into the right trials. In terms of doctor approval, it's very important for a clinician to be involved, in actually advising a patient. It's also why it's important to have independent genetic counselors. And I think that's what's also good about our model is that, the genetic counselors and the genetic sequencing is done independently from the clinical trial sponsor. And so as a result, it gives patients a safe space to discuss their potential worries about the trial, but also, that also helps refine the eligibility criteria, having the genetics status. You talked a little bit about access to clinical trial. I think that's a really important one. One of the blocker, if you have a condition and you want to enroll in a clinical trial that is looking at a specific drug target, is often to know, whether or not you are likely to respond to these drug targets. So if you have to fly halfway across the world to take a genetic test before you're being told that actually, no, you're not eligible for the trial, it's quite an overhead. And to your point, your level of access to clinical trial is going to depend very much on where you live. If your teaching hospital is sort of like a clinical site for clinical trials, then you're much more likely to be referred into one than if you may be in more isolated areas or where your sort of local healthcare centers are more focused on just delivering care and not super involved in research. So part of the appeal in the Sano platform is also democratizing this access, in that people can fill in eligibility criteria and learn more about a clinical trial or research from wherever they are. And in most cases, they can also take the genetic test from the comfort of their own home and actually figure out pretty quickly whether or not the clinical trial will be suited for them before there is any, discussions around having to travel across the world.
That probably cuts out a lot of, obviously you're disappointed if you don't make it on, but it's much harder when you have to go somewhere far away or even not far away. You go for these tests and you're hopeful and you get your hopes up and you think of a world where you might actually be cured or better in some way. And then you've gone through all of these stages to then be told, oh, you're not eligible at all. So I actually think it's very smart to be able to go through these steps first.
I think another aspect about democratizing access to clinical trials is to go globally and to go internationally so that you have genetic diversity. It's a big problem in research right now where clinical trials often focus on the same subsets of the population. This is just not how disease work. And, quite often there are different genetic backgrounds in different populations. And so it's really, really important when running clinical trials to actually have that reach. And one of the big things we felt very strongly about building the Sano platform initially, and that we're sort of progressing on, is to go very global. And that's often one of the reasons companies come to us is, they're starting a trial in the US, but they also want to be able to run it in other countries in the world. And we've developed the sort of software capabilities and the operations capabilities to do the sequencing in a compliant manner with local countries, and have sort of native speakers, genetic counselors, and sort of post-care clinical pathways in all of the countries we want to operate in, which opens up clinical trials to the world stage.
Probably makes it a bit more fair as well, that you're going outside of like specific subsets of people.
Yeah.
As long as you get the word out there that you exist and people sign up, then it's probably giving access to treatments that people never thought that they would be able to have otherwise.
That is very much the idea. I mean, women were excluded from clinical trial for the longest time because their hormones would probably mess with the data. Still today, and for good reasons, initially pregnant women are excluded from clinical trial because obviously we want to make sure that there is no harm to the fetus, and that I believe is right. However, you do have women who fall pregnant during clinical trial, and when that is the case, it's actually a really good opportunity to look at the data in this subset of population. And that's something historically that hasn't been done systematically, and now companies are making more efforts to actually look at this data because as you know, if you've had children, quite often when you're pregnant, the list of medicines or treatment that you can continue taking is extremely limited. And often it's not because it's necessarily unsafe, but it's just because we don't have the data as to whether or not it's safe. And so again, in circumstances where there is a pregnancy in the context of a clinical trial, I think it's really important to look at that data.
Okay, well, I just discovered another thing that women are unfairly treated with.
I mean, obviously nowadays, this was historically, but diversity is so much more than just, woman and men's body. Like there are, when it comes to genetic makeup, you have to cast a really wide net to make sure that you're actually looking at treatment that work, for all populations.
Which is crazy because you've got the makeup of a woman and the makeup of a man is so clearly different. So it's just, it's mind blowing. It's almost like they just want to cure the men. No, not anymore. But before we were disposable.
It is shocking when you look at it today, and hopefully I'm very hopeful again that variations here will be taking into account more and more going forward. But yeah, anyways, to your point around accessibility, that's something we feel really strongly about. And again, that's something that precision medicine needs because by definition, we're looking at individual biological makeups. And so if you look at people, who are historically related in their ancestry, you're only going to cover a small part of the population. So that's barriers that we're trying to break down here, both by using genetics and also going globally.
That's amazing. And you kind of talked about clinical trials. I think the general perception is they do take quite a long time. But
that's fair to say.
What are the stages involved? Is it the actual research and the science that's taking all of those years? Or is it getting stuck in approval stage? What's the holdup?
There is a lot going on at the top of the funnel, right, in terms of drug discovery and the research and so on. But as I was saying earlier, I would say the output of that phase far overtakes the sort of very slow operationalization of then taking these findings into clinical trials, being successful with the clinical trial, and then, getting into the whole other stage of approval, operation, basically manufacturing, healthcare system adoption, and so on. Again, the reason why we created Sano is because we believe the clinical trial stage is one of the biggest bottleneck. There are 3 phases to clinical trials, usually. Phase 1, which is concerned with safety and efficacy. Phase 2, that usually looks at, actually the effects of the treatment and whether they benefit the participants enrolled in the trial. And then a phase 3 that looks at how that compares to existing treatments or alternatives. Again, in itself, it's not that these 3 phases need years and years to be set up. There are some pretty good sort of playbooks for how to run a clinical trial. Often the difficulty is actually in finding the right patients that are likely to benefit from the treatment and to keep them willing to participate throughout the trial. Historically, clinical trial and research has been a little unrewarding for participants, particularly when in cases where it's not the only option, right? It takes time. Often historically has required quite a bit of travel and sometimes invasive, intervention. And at the end of it, most often, that's the end of it. Participants or patients are not even kept updated about the outcome or the finding of the research and so on. And so we really wanted to flip that model on its head, so that the clinical trial process is actually valuable to the patients. They get to learn something interesting about themselves. They get access to not just that one clinical trial necessarily, but actually to a platform that curates content and opportunities for them that are much more likely to progress research and to progress key achievements in the condition. And we, again, provide updates on, what is being done with their data, what we're learning from it, and so on. So really the idea here is to put the patient in the driving seat, and ultimately, a very, very big value of Sano is, to be to have a people first approach. We're very focused on the experience of the patient and again, what this experience is going to be like for them. And we believe that's at the core of making clinical trials in precision medicine successful.
Well, it sounds like you play a very key role because a sort of big problem is top of the funnel. Can you find the right participants? That can take a really long time, whereas you guys are there to step in at that point. But then also keeping them warm and making sure they stay engaged in the trial and stay it out. So
yeah, absolutely. There are lots of barriers to that. Often people go into research or clinical trial with good motivations to actually make a difference, to progress research, and of course, in many cases as well, to potentially access treatment that might improve their outcome, right? But the reality is, if months and years pass, in a person's life, that's a long time, where there is very little update on how that might benefit them or the rest of the world for that matter, and also where there is quite a lot of constraints and barrier to participation, like having to take a blood test, for example. Some people don't like that very much, or having to travel to a hospital an hour away or more from their home. That's a blocker, right? So again, being able to do a lot of the pre-research or pre-trial eligibility screening from home and give access to a much wider range of people is really important.
Yeah, because that's another factor that I didn't even think of. Where's the person located? Because even if they're in the UK, they could be 5 hours from where the trial is. So
that's right.
It's got to be right time, right place, right stage. There are a lot of factors.
There are a lot of factors that make this fail, and it doesn't need to be. It was mind-boggling to me when I first started to look at the industry that a big problem was finding patients. I was like, what do you mean? There are so many of them all over the world, that most likely have this condition and would like to do something about it. I was just sort of scratching my head as to why it was so difficult. But I do understand it now, that there is just a lot of constraints and blockers that come in the way clinical trials are typically structured, that, the sort of era of digitalization, at-home genetic sequencing can remove. And so that's, again, a lot of what we do at Sano is sort of an end-to-end process where ultimately we bring in a lot of expertise in genetics, in clinical settings, in these condition areas to really set up a project that works from the start. And we have in-depth knowledge about where these patients might be located, what are some of the population and demographics constraints that might prevent them from enrolling in the trial, and are able through the software platform to actually make the whole process of identifying them, sequencing them, and again, like making the experience accessible and productive for them, that remove a lot of these barriers.
But you're collecting such valuable data that you might be able to look at this data at some point and think, actually, we've seen a trend.
Yeah.
Somehow you've seen like, okay, it's this ethnicity, this, and you might actually be able to draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, and we're very interested in that, and we do some internal research at Sano. We have quite a few projects that are sort of like our own. Again, I was mentioning earlier our Light the Way project, where we're looking at the genetics of ALS, which is a devastating disease, but there is some progress currently being made in some potential interventions that could change the progression of the disease if, they are starting early on. And this is a research that is led and conducted by Sano, and has been supported by an Innovate UK grant. And we have a couple others like this that are really super interesting to us. I think, again, the more we progress into different condition areas and the more we expand our reach and the more we'll be able to do such research. And again, here it's not, we're an independent third party, so we don't have our own drug here that we're trying to test. So we're really taking a patient first approach where we're using the sequencing to stratify patients into groups so that we can actually present to them the various opportunities that exist out there that might be the best match for their genetic background.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. And I wanted to talk about the role that pharmaceuticals play around this. Obviously, you see all these films of the big bad pharma companies, but you kind of need them to get the drugs.
Yeah.
So there's the good and the bad. But I'll give you an example. If there was a trial for a very, very rare disease and they found there was a magic pill that if they took it every day, great. But it's rare, so you're not going to sell it to that many people. Could that play a role in getting that drug to market?
Yes, it does, and it has more so historically, but I think a lot of progress has been done on that front in recent years. So as you can imagine, a clinical trial is very expensive, costs a lot of money. And so if you pour a ton of money into that and you have maybe hundreds of individuals in the world affected by the condition, the math is quick, right? And historically that has put off pharma companies from going into rare disease. However, this is changing. And for example, in the US, we have the Orphan Drug Act, which has been implemented specifically to actually incentivize pharma companies to work on treatments for these conditions, even if maybe the number of patients affected at the end of the days are not as many as they should be. And I think the key to this is how effective the drug is. The truth is that it doesn't really matter how rare the disease is. If a drug can cure it or can significantly reduce the symptoms, actually, governments have shown again and again that, they will pay the price for these drugs to come to market for these individuals. And so that is actually a ripe area for a lot of pharma companies now to look into rare disease. And I think I'm certainly seeing a lot of research into it. It's changing. I think, again, advances in genetics are also making this more feasible and more cost efficient, which is really great to see. Feel very passionate about rare disease at Sano. It's something that affects many more people than we think of, because the term is, implies that it concerns so very few people. But again, as I said earlier, taken collectively, it affects a whole lot of people. And in our team, I think we match quite closely the statistics of 1 in 7 people, because probably about 1 in 7 of us in our own Sano team have a family member or are affected by a rare disease. And so we felt very, very strongly working with patient groups here and progressing research in rare disease.
Yes, because I was going to ask, you kind of answered it already though, but I was going to ask, how much is money a factor here? But it's everything really, because the clinical trials cost so much money, and then producing the drug there's like a lot of elements that do involve money. I guess my question is, if you're looking at the UK and you've got the National Health Service, which is obviously free, and then you've got some people who have got private healthcare, is it fair to assume that if you have access to more funds and private healthcare, that you might have more access to more treatments than on the NHS, just purely because the NHS can't afford it?
I don't necessarily think so, and maybe that will be surprising as an answer, but ultimately a drug has to be approved, like before it's being prescribed to someone, let it be privately or publicly. And generally the process of getting approved, is overseen by government bodies. And so when a drug is approved, it's approved both for the private and the public. That said, I think where you're right is if a drug is very expensive, it's more likely not to be as available on the NHS as it would be if covered by insurance. It's a less acute issue here in the UK and in Europe, generally speaking, than it is in the US, I would say. For me, the key to solving this problem is to make clinical trials cheaper. And it's actually to make sure that we can run them at a cost that is reasonable. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly at this point in the conversation, recruiting patients and getting them enrolled into clinical trial is one of the biggest costs of running a clinical trial. To give you an example, I've seen some clinical trials where the company decides to open 40 sites across the world, and where at the end of year 1 or year 2, only 3 or 4 of these sites have actually had a patient referred into the trial. So you can imagine the huge inefficiencies, and in a way that's due to sort of slightly outdated way of recruiting patients, where you partner up with a bunch of hospital on already sort of, working with time-stretched physicians and consultants and admin staff that, on top of their regular duty, have to take some time to refer into clinical trial. And the whole system is pretty broken in that way. Like, there is tons of money that just go out there into identifying the patients to start with. So again, my view on this is having genetically sequenced patients that can take at least part of the eligibility screening from their own home and referred into clinical trials where the drug is most likely to be effective and effective quickly is the way to make this a lot cheaper, and as a result, to make drugs coming at the end of the process also more affordable to, healthcare systems to be able to buy.
Well, it's incredible, and I think it's incredible the difference that it could make. Moving over to your personal journey in terms of starting a business, I'd imagine from an investor perspective, you look at what's going to make you money, what's the time frame. And I guess with any startup in the kind of biomedical or life sciences field, it's long game. You're probably not going to see fast results. So what was your investment journey like? And would you say it is harder when they're not going to see the monetary benefits from it for possibly many years to come?
I would say some of the difficulties we've encountered fundraising have been that we are at the interaction of software and life science. And so quite often, biotech investors don't necessarily understand the sort of like software model, and typical software investors don't have a in-depth knowledge of like the typical pharmaceutical and biotech sales cycle. We are in a unique position at Sano in that we are fundamentally R&D focused life science company, but we are a software company. All of our resources really are, software and people related. We work with partners of labs across the world, which makes us more resilient. I think we've seen recently, unfortunately, the collapse of some major labs or direct to consumer companies. And so again, for us, we took the mindset from the start that, we didn't want to develop our own laboratories. We just wanted to make sure that we work with networks of vendors to make sure that we provide a really robust and solid offering, in terms of being able to maintain the rate as well at which we sequence patients so that we can potentially cope with very high volumes. And so to go back to your question, we do not have, we're not in a situation where we have to wait years to see the results. We 5x'd our revenue last year. And it's something that, again, we didn't necessarily set out to do in this particular way when we were initially mission driven in building the company. But it's one of the beauty, I think, of the platform that we built. We can deliver results really, really quickly, and we can make this match happen really, really quickly because ultimately we're a software company.
Yeah, that's genius. I have to ask you, did you follow the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos case?
Yes, I did.
Found it fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, essentially, she was trying to just get quicker results from blood test. Well, she wasn't actually really trying, was she? She was using somebody else's technology, but she raised, 100 million, 200 million?
I'm waiting to see where this segue is going.
Do you know what? I didn't plan this question. I didn't write it down, but it came to mind when we were talking about like precision medicine or more so like quick diagnosis. I think I was just genuinely curious what you thought about the whole debacle.
I mean, what I think about the whole debacle is really, I don't know, it's appalling. Like ultimately, like in this case, this wasn't really a case of trying to go faster, was it? This was fabrication of results. Like as a scientist and someone who actually cares about advancing scientific research and patients, that's just fraud. So again, I feel like I need to put this in context, right? When I say that we are trying to facilitate the transition into precision medicine and make clinical trials happen on a much faster timescale, we're talking here about matchmaking patients based on their genetic background with research projects. We're not talking about fast-tracking scientific results that are fabricated in any way, shape, or form, right? Genetic data doesn't lie, and it's a very stable technology. We're not inventing a new technology.
No.
We're using existing, established, regulated technologies like whole genome sequencing, for example, or genotyping in very regulated, CLIA/CAP certified or IVD certified labs across the world to give patients faster access to genetic sequencing so that they can enroll into clinical trials or research projects that are the most likely to make a difference for them, and as a result reduce the costs and accelerate the pace at which clinical trials are led and bring an actual treatment to the public.
And you actually finished university, so that probably helps.
I actually did it.
Yes.
I did. I dropped off my PhD.
Did you?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, but you had the degree before
Yes,
that.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so like not quite the same.
No. But I did. We did raise fundings partway through my PhD, which was one of the very difficult decisions of my life.
I think that's a fair reason to drop out.
It was.
Because you're probably doing the PhD to get to the point at which you'd already reached.
Yeah.
In a way.
Ultimately, I loved my PhD. It was very sad for me to stop it. But ultimately, we got to the point where Sano was really building traction. And we had a lot of researchers around us coming to us and saying, oh, this is brilliant. Like I need something like this. Like I've been, I've spent half of my PhD or half of my postdocs, like trying to actually like figure out how I could get access to the data that I need. And that was really encouraging. And we had investors also show early interest and come to us and just say, well, look, this is great. This has potential, but like you need to throw yourself in it if I'm going to invest money, right? And we just felt like the momentum was there. And ultimately, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier in the sort of presentation that for me, it came down to this is where I can have the most impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of your co-founders is your husband, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
You really killed, I'd say 2 birds with one stone. I'm going to go with about 5 because you did university, marriage, company.
Yes. 2 children.
2 children.
Yep.
So which co-founder is it?
William, the CTO. Yeah.
Okay. And what's it like? co-founding a business with a husband? As in, were you dating when you started?
Yes, we were.
Okay, so you went into it already.
We went into
as
it
a
already,
relationship.
yeah.
Because I speak to a lot of co-founders who are couples, and actually I've heard that it works incredibly well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, like we've not really known anything else. Like, you know, we've always built this whilst being a couple.
Yeah.
What it's like, to be honest, it's great because, you know, building a company is quite a unique thing to do. What we're trying to achieve is like quite a unique mission. So in a way, it's really great to have your person like understand this and be able to share that with them. We are a trio of co-founders, and I think this is brilliant as well. We have a really great relationship. Patrick is, you know, like was witness at our wedding. He's our children's, you know, godfather. And basically it also brings a really nice balance. We like to say that in our sort of founder trio, Patrick is the American optimism, Will is the British pragmatism, and I am the French criticism. So it works pretty well. We balance each other out really well. Again, I'm the COO, Will is the CTO. We obviously interact a lot, but we tend to also have our own separate domains.
So you're not lying in bed at night like, oh, did you see that data today? Man.
We probably are.
Yeah. I think that's quite cute. I'm going to go with couple goals there.
All right.
So in terms of and I know this is always a hard question to ask founders because you never quite know where the journey is going to take you.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, what do you want for Sano? And like, what is, I won't say end goal because you never know, but the big ambitions that you really, really have?
Yeah. I went into this, again, I mentioned it quite a lot through the conversation, but with a drive for impact. Like ultimately the end goal for me is to see treatments, you know, like happen for people who wouldn't otherwise have access to them because of Sano. That is sort of like my North Star metrics, right? Is just ultimately how many people are potentially going to receive a cure, or if not a cure, at least a treatment that enables them to live fuller, richer lives as a result of us existing. And, you know, I'd love that to be on steroids. I just would love for the platform to enable treatments to come to fruition in like a range of conditions across the world. And for us to finally find, you know, treatments for conditions that just, you know, leave devastating consequences on families. I've been, you know, like really humbled to see in my own environment and in my own team, people have to go through the worry, the pain and the sorrow of seeing a loved one suffer from a condition and or pass away. And I just, you know, it makes you just want to scream and just say, why does this have to happen? Like, there must be a way. There are a lot of intelligent people on this planet that just figure something out. But if everyone is trying to work on this problem in isolation, one at a time, it just won't happen fast enough and in a big enough way to really make a difference. So for me, the aim for Sano, again, as a software platform, is just to use like the best technology has to offer so that we can, in a way, organize our brain together and just match, you know, like research with people who need that research across the world in a much faster time scale. So in terms of the end goal, my aim is for Sano to become the platform that both patients and research or pharma companies go to basically make clinical trial happens in the safest and sort of most productive way so that the patients, you know, that enroll into them have the highest odds of success and that drugs can come to the market and help a higher number of people as fast as possible and in a safe way. I think, you know, the purpose of clinical trial is to test if a drug is safe and it's to test if it works. So it would be crazy of me to imagine a world in which every clinical trial is just perfect and works and no one has side effects. But at the very least, I'd love for precision medicine to form the basis of the sort of data set that we use in clinical trials so that we can have a much better understanding on, you know, where it's more likely to work and where it's the least likely to cause side effects.
I love that. And lastly, is there anything us as individuals can do to educate ourselves, help in any way? Because this is such the big ecosystem and so many different people at different stages. But I'd imagine anyone listening to this would think, oh, should I go and get DNA testing? What would you advise individuals to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are always things that people can do to understand a little bit more about their conditions. I also think sometimes it's a bit unfair, like, to put the onus on people to say, hey, you should educate. Like, ultimately, like, most people are not doctors or don't have a scientific training. So really my hope actually is that there is a much better system that works in the patient's best interest, where we don't have a one-size-fits-all to medicine. In terms of your question on, like, should everybody get genetically sequenced, it's a thorny issue. I don't think that's the answer. And again, that is why at Sano we don't do just broad direct-to-consumer genetic sequencing. Genetics are complicated, and often just having a test that shows you, oh, you have a susceptibility to XYZ, like we probably all have some of this, if we look at our whole genome, can just be unsettling and lead to unnecessary intervention. So I'm a big proponent of technology. I'm very enthusiastic about the role genetics can play in the future of medicine, but I would also say that we just need to be cautious and just a little bit measured with our approach. It makes sense to get genetic sequencing if you have a specific condition that is known to have genetic roots, or if potentially family members are affected by it. So that you can access, therapies, or you can understand a little bit more about prevention. I think just a general approach of leaving it with the patient to have to make their own decision about whether sequencing is right for them and what treatment or clinical trial they need to enroll to is a lot and potentially has consequence. So we take this very seriously at Sano in terms of our role in providing the right support for the patients, providing them with genetic counseling, really mapping out quite clearly the post-test pathway. If someone tests positive, like, it's all and well to be offering genetic sequencing, but how do we then make sure these patients are appropriately referred to the right consultants, the right care, without burdening, like the NHS as well, or any other healthcare system unnecessarily? So these are things we think about very carefully. We think we can add a lot of value alongside the healthcare system in potentially giving access to people to genetic sequencing in the context of a specific condition. But it needs to be done very carefully, and it needs to be done in the patient's best interest.
Well, it definitely comes off how passionate you are and how much you genuinely care about it, which is really refreshing. I'm in awe of the work you're doing. It's incredible, and can't wait to see your technology facilitate the cure of every awful disease out there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was great.